Good evening, everyone, and thanks to Nathan and Elaine and David for inviting me tonight, and thank you all for coming, especially three of you who've travelled all the way from my home parish in Blean, and so it's really good to see some familiar faces. John Constable, who lived from 1776 until 1837, surprised everyone because he took his best inspiration from the locality where he was brought up, and not, as other painters did, from great mountain landscapes or famous foreign places. He wrote, "But I should paint my own places best. Painting is but another word for feeling. I associate my careless boyhood to all that lies on the banks of the river Stour. They made me a painter, and I am grateful. That is, I had often thought of pictures of them before I had ever touched a pencil." More recently, another painter, the Cornishman Peter Lanyon, 1918 to 1964, also knew his own places. He took art students for walks and climbs around his native West Cornwall in order to experience the landscape, urging them to look around rocks and lie in the grass. Here was an environment which should be absorbed by all the senses, needing to be smelt, heard and felt. An art critic later noted the importance of Peter Lanyon's deep personal relationship with his home environment near Land's End. The critic wrote, "Lanyon searches for something which includes a sailor's knowledge of the coastline, a poacher's knowledge of the cover, a miner's knowledge of the seams, a surveyor's knowledge of the contours, a native's knowledge of the local ghosts, a painter's knowledge of the light." John Constable and Peter Lanyon were landscape painters who, in their own times and in their own ways, made pictures of the places which seemed most meaningful to them. Constable is well known, but Peter Lanyon, though highly regarded by art historians, is today still not that well known. At first sight, pictures by Peter Lanyon look very different from those by Constable, but several intriguing parallels can be drawn between the lives and, to an extent, the works of the two men. Both men came from families which had prospered as a result of the activities of secondary industries through which, arguably, the efforts of ordinary labourers were exploited. Constable's father owned a milling business, whilst Lanyon's family had been involved in the manufacture of engineering equipment used in Cornish tin and copper mines. Each painter was, as I said just now, emotionally attached to a particular locality associated with childhood. Both painters are now celebrated by art historians because of their innovative brushwork techniques, and both can be said to have contributed to a reinvention of the meaning and aims of landscape painting in their own times. What fascinates me above all about these two painters is the way they both display a preoccupation with what we call the social landscape. In other words, the activities, impact and experiences of the human inhabitants of the places they knew and depicted, not just how these places look in views. What's more, each considered and expressed this preoccupation from his own political and religious angles. First, let's look in more detail at John Constable's religious understanding of landscape, which is actually tied up with his political views. Constable came from what we would now describe as the political right, and embraced the idea of an orderly social stratification in the rural population, seeing it as evidence of divine creation and the ongoing sovereignty of God. John Constable died in 1837, the year Queen Victoria came to the throne. In recent generations, his landscape paintings have enjoyed popular appreciation because of their notes of tranquility, their true-to-life qualities, and their capacity to connect viewers to nature's beauty in what is often assumed to have been a simpler and more settled age. Yet Constable was in many ways a revolutionary artist living in revolutionary times. Some of his best-known works need to be understood in the context of the social and political changes which were taking place in English society during his lifetime. The artist's father, Golding Constable, owned, as I said, the family's milling business, and it was assumed that John, the second son in the family, might be destined for the priesthood. He went to a boarding school at Lavenham in Suffolk and ultimately to Dedham Grammar School. Through his education, he would come to share in a set of religious ideals associated with the upper echelons of the society in which he was growing up. In early adulthood, Constable's famous poet was William Cowper, 1731 to 1800, and in a letter to Maria Bicknell, whom he later married, Constable indicates his understanding of the poet's aims. He wrote, "How delighted I am that you are so fond of Cowper, but how could it be otherwise? For he is the poet of religion and nature." Constable also knew of the writings of the clergyman Gilbert White of Selborne, an observer of the life of plants and changes of seasons, for whom the celebration of local nature was also a celebration of the workings of God. And we know that he was familiar with Archibald Alison's Essays on the Nature and Principles of Taste from 1790. The artist, reading this work in 1814, was particularly excited by the thrust of one particular essay. And in another letter to Maria, he described how Archibald Alison considers us as endowed with minds capable of comprehending the beauty and sublimity of the material world, only as the means of leading us to religious sentiment. It is like a gentle and unreproaching friend whose voice is ever in alliance with goodness and virtue, who is alone able to soothe misfortune. Constable's famously large 6-footer landscape paintings, like the Haywain here, are the work of a mature artist who believed that a natural subject, which he understood to reflect divine qualities, was worth the kind of near monumental treatment which had previously been reserved in painting for the important historical, mythological, and biblical subjects which people expected to see and interpreted in London galleries, especially the Royal Academy. And Constable seems to have been the first painter to put the ordinary English countryside centre stage in this way. He didn't paint these big landscape pictures just because he thought people like us would think they looked nice. He did it because there was a moral and religious reason for it. Throughout his adult life, John Constable was a fervent supporter of the Anglican Church. He appreciated the position of the church and clergy within local communities and was committed to the centrality and interconnectedness of church and state in the structures of society. And in some respects, the Book of Common Prayer, with its firm advocacy of the political status quo, its support for the monarch, and its reminders of English society's complete reliance on God's providence, in some respects it's one of the best commentaries on Constable's paintings. And here's a prayer book collect. "O God, whose never-failing providence ordereth all things, both in heaven and on earth, we humbly beseech thee to put away from us all hurtful things, and to give us those things which may be profitable for us. And paintings like the Glebe Farm would have reminded the original viewers of how the church was socially, politically and economically integrated with the rural scene out in the English countryside. So the title, The Glebe Farm, is significant because, of course, glebe land was land owned by the church. Constable wasn't alone in having these views. And in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, people generally held that the created world and the humanity which inhabited it was intended to reflect a set of heavenly ideals, and they sought to interpret both the natural and social landscape accordingly. Constable's contemporary, the intellectual and book publisher Robert John Thornton, and there he is, and his dates were 1768 to 1837, was famous for his production of an important illustrated volume, The Temple of Flora, or Garden of Nature, it was called. And it was the third part of an ambitious botanical work published between 1797 and 1807. Now, these days, these books are highly sought after by modern collectors because they want to take them apart and sell these very detailed hand-coloured prints of flowering plants. And many of these are shown in a contrived landscape setting like the one on the screen there. And these landscape settings that the plants were given was pretty much unique in their period. Now, Robert John Thornton was the second son in a wealthy family, and he, like Constable, was once destined for the Anglican priesthood. And Thornton's Christian perspective is never in doubt, and in a later work, The Religious Use of Botany, Thornton remarks, "Adore the supreme benefactor for his blessings, for the blessings he showers down upon every order of beings. Adore him for numberless mercies which are appropriated to thyself. But above all, adore him for that noble gift of a rational and immortal soul, which constitutes us as masters of the globe and gives us the real enjoyment of its riches, which discovers 10,000 beauties which might otherwise have been lost, and renders them both a source of light and a nursery of devotion. By virtue of this exalted principle, we are qualified to admire our Maker's works and capable of bearing his illustrious image." Thornton, like Constable, was a supporter of the established British Constitution, writing passionately in its defence. And for him, the political status quo maintained an appropriate balance between the powers of the monarch, the aristocracy, and the people. Thornton's understanding of the ordering of society is often reflected in the botanical illustrations in the Temple of Flora, through the relationships between the floral subjects and their respective landscape backgrounds, and in the written commentaries. Constable would have been aware of Thornton's project, as original drawings for the Temple of Flora were shown at the Royal Academy. Where he chooses to, Thornton evokes the places of origins of plants using subtle references and devices. But these visual references can and do allude to notions of status as well as origin. And this is no coincidence, because Thornton's work seeks to establish what he believes to be a natural social hierarchy among plants, which corresponds to an equally natural social hierarchy in British society. And he writes, "Some flowers rear their heads with a majestic mien and overlook, like sovereigns or nobles, the whole parterre. Others seem more moderate in their aims and advance only to the middle stations. A genius turned for heraldry might term them the gentry of the border, while others, free from all aspiring views, creep unambitiously on the ground and look like the commonalty of the kind. And in Thornton's Snowdrops, which you can see on the screen, the little plants with lowered heads are seen against a worked agricultural landscape. The diminutive flowers are in stark contrast with the grander blooms depicted in other images. And a poem accompanies the illustration of the superb lily, which is there. The poem tells how this very confident-looking plant has a desire to emerge from her damp, shadowy surroundings, but would quickly meet her death as a result of exposure to the full heat and light of the sun. And this is a plant parable, warning of the dangers of revolt against the existing order, or more simply, of having ideas above one's station. Thornton's work sets out to show a divinely established natural order which structures the vegetable kingdom in the same way as it does the human kingdom, writes a scholar called Clonk, who's written a lot about Thornton. So the book is a work of theology and moral admonishment, as well as one of botany, poetry, and science. Back to Constable. In Constable's case, the importance of the close relationship between the church and the state was also indicated in his personal life. The artist's principal patron and closest intellectual companion was John Fisher, who was to become Archdeacon of Salisbury. The two men engaged in correspondence, which reveals how they shared a commitment and affection for the religion of the establishment. In the case of the artist, it's often been suggested that these feelings are indicated in many of his paintings by the presence of church towers. And a commentator wrote, "The church tower, so often a compositional accent for Constable, also emphasized God's guiding role in creation, his word being transmitted via a church firmly integrated within the political system. And towers repeatedly appear as motifs in Constable's iconic images of the Stour Valley countryside. They're seen on the horizons of Landscape, Dedham Vale, 1828, View of Dedham, 1815, Stour Valley and Dedham Village, 1814, and Sketch for View on the Stour near Dedham, 1822, and so on. And very significantly, in the one that's up on the screen now, in the final version of The Leaping Horse, which was done in 1825, the tower of Dedham Church seems to have been positioned at the very far right of the picture. Now, in reality, if you visit the spot where the painting was made, the church tower is not there. It's not actually in that position. So it's been deliberately put there by the artist. And in fact, there's another version of this painting, The Leaping Horse, which was done a little bit earlier, and the tower is not present in that. Constable was anxious about threats of changes to the existing political and social order. His concerns about challenges to the relationship between church and state are subtly reflected in a number of later paintings where he apparently communicates his own feelings about political and constitutional developments. The artist was so committed to the ideal of a structured orderliness of society that it's not surprising that the implications of Catholic emancipation affected him deeply, and the repeal of the Test Act and the Corporation Act in 1829 and the enacting of the Emancipation Act, also in 1829, threatened to end the union of the Church and Constitution. It didn't in the end, but it threatened to. Constable feared that the Reform Bill of 1831 would lead to an undermining of the constitution of the country, and, he said, would give the government into the hands of the rabble and dregs of the people and the devil's agents on earth, the agitators. And paintings by Constable which date from this difficult time include Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows, with its stormy sky. And a cathedral seems to be deployed to serve as a visual metaphor for the national church, which is under a political cloud. Although the presence of the rainbow may be intended to evoke the resolution witnessed in the story of Noah's Ark. Perhaps Constable was already beginning to feel that things were not turning out as badly as he first imagined, or that God himself would keep his ancient promise and ensure that things would not be flooded by political chaos. The theological perspective adopted by Constable and Thornton seems to lack understanding and generosity with regard to the specific needs and aspirations of those who worked on the land. Farm labourers and other country folk are absent from Thornton's plates, and surprisingly and controversially, given his chosen subject matter, they only enjoy a minimal and marginal presence in paintings by Constable. Given the challenges which are known to have been faced by ordinary people who lived and worked in the countryside during this period, it's hard to accept from a modern perspective that these labourers were the beneficiaries of anything we might call divine providence. Clergy, who were often related to the local landed gentry, were likely to have been grounded in the theological and political perspectives which were embraced by Constable and Thornton, and they too would have seen no reason to challenge a system in which the rural poor were economically trapped. In J.J. Bunt's The Duties of the Parish Priest, 1856, the foundation of village schools is encouraged, but not, as we might hope, as a way of offering the possibility of social and economic mobility to the rising generation. On the contrary, as part of their education, youngsters would be reminded of the importance of accepting their lot in life as a religious duty. For Blunt, frugal, regular and industrial habits in the labouring class, which, if not religion in themselves, are generally akin to it, conduce to it, and rarely indeed are long separated from it. And jumping on a little bit to the 1840s, there's that verse in the still popular hymn by Cecil Francis Alexander, All Things Bright and Beautiful, and there's the one that we don't usually sing anymore now. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. And the author's main intention was really there to reassure people that every single soul was part of God's creation and had a special place in the divine ordering of things. There is an important comma after God made them. God made them, comma, high and lowly, comma, and ordered their estate. So it was meant to be reassuring, but that kind of reassurance is not enough for us. And in fact, in the mid-19th century, country dwellers who had little or nothing to lose, or who believed that they could and should improve their prospects, were finding new opportunities in the mills and factories, on the railways and roads, and at the quarries and mines. New kinds of physical and social landscape were the result, with their own attendant dangers and disfigurements. And painters and poets would need to discover fresh angles of theological interpretation. And a very important date to remember in English history is 1851, because the census of 1851 for the first time revealed that more people were living in towns and cities than in the countryside. Now we're going to move to the 20th century and from Suffolk to West Cornwall. And the painter we're going to focus on is Peter Lanyon, but we will start with a Cornish poet. Jack Clemmow, 1916 to 1994, was raised in the China clay mining district of mid-Cornwall, spending all but the last 10 years of his life there. His childhood memories were vital to him as he suffered from the onset of both deafness and blindness in comparatively early adulthood. And the derelict landscape where he lived since birth is still dominated by big white spoil heaps and disused industrial buildings, and it's often described as lunar in appearance. Clemmow, like Constable, knew his own places best, and as Margaret Drabble has commented, found reminders of Christian salvation in his home terrain. And moreover, commenting on Clemmow's poem called Sufficiency from 1951, part of which I'll read in a moment, one critic suggests that the poet cannot contemplate the possibility of another landscape, of another geography, being expressive of the religious truths he holds dear. So here's a bit of Clemmow's poem, Sufficiency. Yes, I might well grow tired of citing flowers all day long, of making my song of the mud in the kiln, of the wired poles on the clay dump. But where should I find my personal pulse of prayer if I turned from the broken, scarred and unkempt land, the hard contours of dogma, the colourless hills? Is there a flower that thrills like frayed rope? Is there grass that cools like gravel? And are there streams which murmur as clay silt does, that Christ redeems? I have not heard of any. In the poem, Clemmow claims to derive theological and spiritual insights not from what we often call nature as God intended, but from his own meditations on man-made features of a landscape which has been deeply scarred by human industrial activity. The poet is turning normal, natural theology on its head. Clemmow's Sufficiency acts as the gateway through which the complex world of his painter contemporary, Peter Lanyon, can now be entered. At the beginning of my talk, Peter Lanyon was introduced alongside John Constable, and a number of immediate parallels were drawn between the lives and achievements of the two men. Both artists were interested in the fullest possible encounter with the landscapes they knew most deeply, including the social history of their districts, and interpretations of patterns of human occupation and industry were as important to them as the simple appearance of the scenery. Constable's religious perspective made him want to see the landscape as indicative of the orderly creation, continuing providence and sovereignty of God. Peter Lanyon, meanwhile, was preoccupied with the extreme hardships experienced by working communities in the recent history of West Cornwall, including farmers and tin miners. And this gave rise to issues and anxieties which in his art and writing he associated with Christian themes of suffering and redemption. Although Lanyon was working at the same time as Jack Clemmow and responding to a similar kind of environment, there's nothing to suggest that the two men met. They did, in fact, live at opposite ends of Cornwall, and they weren't in any sense associates, but we do know from recently discovered correspondence that Lanyon was familiar with some of Clemmow's writing. Lanyon was born in the seaside town of St Ives in West Cornwall in 1918, and his father was a cultured socialist and was keen to impart ideas of justice and social equality to his son, along with the belief that the arts were a central part of civilized life. And a significant experience for Lanyon was when, at the age of 20, he visited relatives in South Africa. Although he was impressed by the landscape, he was shocked by the prevailing social attitudes, especially the exploitation of black labour by the white minority. But, writes a commentator, in Africa he saw a landscape formed, like Cornwall, by the people who lived and worked in it. African peasant farmers had their counterparts in the miners, fishermen and farmers of West Penwith. In many ways, West Cornwall was to Lanyon what the Stour Valley and the village of East Bergolt had been to Constable. John Constable painted with feeling at times when social upheaval was altering the economy of the rural areas which he knew well. Paintings which first appear to be celebrating the stability and tranquility of the English landscape are often sentimental recollections of a past age before the impact of the harsh changes in the way land was used and distributed in Constable's time, before those changes had been felt. Peter Lanyon, too, was well aware of social changes and deprivations which were occurring and had occurred in the farming and mining villages in the locality to which he was particularly attached. He showed a strong emotional sensitivity to his environment, even to the extent that he seems to have felt some personal responsibility for the hardships associated with the tin and copper mining in West Cornwall. He was implicated by his family's history of profiteering from the industry through its engineering business. A number of Lanyon's paintings from the early 1950s, made at the height of his career, feature and resonate with ideas, symbols and stories from the Christian tradition. Lanyon's painting Beaujuyan Farms from 1951 to 2 is an abstract landscape which was first exhibited in London in March 1952. And the work relates to farms near the coast of Cornwall between the town of St Ives and the village of Batalloch, a coastal settlement some miles to the west. In Lanyon's time, these were some of the least productive farms in Europe, with the result that there was plenty of evidence of economic decline, including many ruined farm buildings, which to this day are all busily being converted into posh little cottages. The painting seems to make reference to immediate sensory experiences associated with its subject, including sea, sky, grass, and rock. And in a detailed explanation of the work from 1963, the artist points out that there is a symbolic dimension as well, with its suggestion of animal forms and strange half figures. Can you sort of see the horse if you look carefully? He also commented, in the farms painting there are many meanings, but they are all meanings of farmness. Animals are implied and not representational according to photo vision. Lanyon explained, this isn't a mining but a farming picture, a bucolic scene, rather earthy. On the left there's the sea at the top and grass and hayricks. The middle is some sort of animal, even a head. And on the right, the chaff which comes from the corn and harvesting. In some ways, I think it's a picture about birth and life and death, which is why it belongs with the crucifixion. Dry stone walls that run around the farms in this part of Cornwall divide up the sections of Beaujuyan Farms. Lanyon intimates that he intended Beaujuyan Farms to form part of a scheme belonging with a crucifixion. And the crucifixion to which he refers was another picture, eventually titled Saint Just, and it's an enormous picture, about 7.5 feet high, painted in 1953. And Saint Just is the same overall size as Beaujuyan Farms, but it's in what we call portrait format, which means it hangs vertically rather than horizontally. And it's a truly man-sized picture. St. Just's forms, colours and texture indicate that it is a landscape painting, and its title relates to a particular place. The granite-built town, consisting of miners' cottages and disused industrial buildings, which is located further down the coast from Batalic, within sight of Land's End. And in the painting, this dull green field colour predominates, and a system of black lines which break up the green ground suggests the ancient stone walls that create the field patterns around the town. They're very ancient field patterns. But it's the allusions to Christian narrative, doctrine and experience which are bound up with these features, and Lanyon's own descriptions of the work which give it huge significance for this evening's theme. "I'm painting a crucifixion," wrote Lanyon in a note appended to a letter he posted in January 1952. Lanyon was working on St. Just, this painting, over a period of at least 17 months. And during this time, he changed the painting's official title. At first, it referred directly to the crucifixion, an historical and doctrinal event, but the painting was eventually named after the locality to which it relates, the town St. Just. The close association of this landscape painting with the imagery of crucifixion has, from the very beginning, influenced the way its formal composition has been seen and interpreted. The central vertical black section has been described as both a mine shaft and the shaft of a cross. Meanwhile, and I don't know if you can see it, little red, white and blue markings towards the right of the bottom of the cross have been said to evoke images of the Virgin Mary bowing her head in grief, which you often get in medieval and Renaissance pictures of the crucifixion, the Virgin Mary at the foot of the cross. And whilst Beaujulian farms seemed to comment on agricultural decline, St. Just makes a parallel statement about industrial decline, and St. Just works as an image of a place, a lament about industrial exploitation, and as a metaphorical crucifixion. Now, Cornish miners from the St. Just area endured considerable hardship in the 19th and early 20th centuries, whether in or out of work. As well as the daily grind resulting in an alarmingly short average life expectancy, accidents were frequent. 31 miners suddenly lost their lives in a disaster in 1919, which involved the man engine, a lifting contraption which they were using to ascend from the lower depths of after their shift at Levant Mine, half a mile from the town of St. Just. And the obvious Y shape in the middle of St. Just, which could be both a mine shaft and a cross form, seems to symbolize the sacrifice of the miners, especially those involved in that famous tragedy. Lanyon thought that the miners were victim of what he said was a social system that is absolutely criminal. He wrote, "If you walk along this coast, you can't escape this shame. There's a great pressure of human suffering that's gone on, and St. Just itself is like a town waiting. One day at Levant Mine, there was an accident and some 200 men were lost, and they were climbing the man engine to the surface." He was obviously wrong. It wasn't 200, it was 31, but obviously he knew about the disaster. As early as April 1952, Lanyon had completed what he said were 3 large sketches for a crucifixion, all 8 foot tall. And one of these that still exists is essentially a representation of a human corpse with crucified feet and a hint of outstretched arms. Although in one sense, in the final version of St. Just, and as Lanyon himself observed, Christ is nowhere, yet a familiarity with the meaning of the work, its history, and its references to suffering mean that Christ is everywhere. It's quite easy to identify features within St. Just which align the work with classic crucifixion paintings from the Western tradition. The cross, maybe the Virgin, and maybe the crown of thorns, that barbed wire near the top. Lanyon wrote, "The tragedy is the presence of man adjusting to the granite and his impossible task when it's seen as a spiritual one as well, to go down and be lifted up. More than ever, it is the cross that I see, and there again, the man who's seeing all of his journey and seeing then that it is impossible would have somewhere to go, to rest in Christ's arms." But crucifixion imagery and associations do not end within the confines of the image of St. Just. In 1963, Lanyon explained that he had intended to present the work as the central panel of a triptych, so as to make its religious meaning clear. He wrote, "I painted 2 tall pictures to go on either side. They were landscapes, but they were also mourners on either side of the cross." 2 landscapes were to stand in for mourners. So the landscape is humanized and here given a role in mourning its own social and physical tragedies, and also mourning the tragedy of the crucifixion of Christ. Peter Lanyon had described St. Just as a crucifixion, and by putting the image within a scheme which follows the conventions of medieval and Renaissance altarpieces, all the associations and power of a form so often used within traditional Christian art would be evoked. This is an extraordinary religious interpretation of the Cornish landscape. For Lanyon, the creation of St. Just certainly involved more than a mere making of a visual representation of something as an end product. It also entailed a degree of personal involvement. The artist, expressing his subject matter in religious terms, dealing with the themes of suffering, death, and redemption, recalled the history of the region, which he found so disturbing. He also seemed troubled by his family's previous connections with the mining industry and by his own apparently tortured imagination. Now, St. Just, of course, and the paintings that go with it, they're not necessarily attractive paintings, but of course that is not the point, because there are so many other points and issues that lie behind them. And describing the painting St. Just and the works associated with it, a commentator concludes, "These landscapes are places of experience and history. In evoking a religious resonance, Lanyon attempts to express something universal in the everyday. He uses place to reflect broader collective experiences common to all, birth and death, spirituality and industry, emotion and intuition." Jack Clemmow, whose 1951 poem Sufficiency I read out earlier, was a staunch evangelical Christian, and his faith, together with the desire to witness to it, is as powerfully evident in his poems and writings as it was in his spoken discourse. In contrast, all recent attempts to gain insights into Peter Lanyon's personal religious convictions have yielded inconclusive results. Lanyon once spoke of his Christian beliefs, but the artist's wife, Sheila, asserted that her late husband was not exclusively Christian, having an interest in all religions. One of his sons described his father as an atheist. Lanyon clearly used Christian symbols to convey meanings of a more universal nature, but in some paintings indicated by the titles and writings, there's evidence to show that he freely drew on the mythologies of other cultures and religions. The recent and contemporary religious environments are a far cry from the one inhabited by John Constable. In the late 20th and 21st centuries, people possessing a Christian sensibility may also pursue a lively interest in a range of spiritualities and religious outlooks, both from within Christian culture in its broadest sense and also from outside it. Lanyon was not a practicing Christian in the sense that Constable and Clement were. His spirituality was clearly eclectic. But, like Constable, Lanyon was preoccupied with moral meanings of the social landscape with reference to its theological dimensions. Lanyon displayed a profound and personal sympathy for the plight of the suffering labourers who'd shaped the landscape into what it had become. As a consequence, powerful elements of redemption mythology are seen in his painting and writing, but his works are no more effective in actually achieving any liberation for these downtrodden communities than Constable's were.